Welcome, colleagues, to this webinar to launch a special issue of the International Review of Education entitled 70 Years with UNESCO, the Role of the International Review of Education in Advancing Comparative Education and Lifelong Learning. My name is Paul Stanistreet. I'm editor of the International Review of Education, and I'm one of three co-editors of this special issue alongside Maren Elfert, IRE Submissions Editor and Senior Lecturer in International Education at the School of Education, Communication and Society at King's College London, and Stephen Roach, IRE Reviews Editor and former Executive Editor of IRE. I'm very pleased and excited to launch this issue, which marks 70 years of continuous publication of IRE with UNESCO. I'd like to thank our speakers for being so generous with their time and sharing the work that they undertook for this issue, and indeed all of our authors who've engaged with such enthusiasm with the task, which was, in short, to use the very rich back catalogue of the journal to explore some of the key themes with which IRE has engaged over the decades, and to do so in a forward-looking, relevant way. Although the issue is not quite finalized, it should be published in the next few days. All of our panelists' articles have been published and they can all be accessed freely online. The links to their articles and brief details of the authors will be shared in the chat at the start of each contribution. We're not able to answer questions live, but they can be put through the Q&A box to the panelists. The panelists and editors will do their best to answer them during the session. If we can't respond during it, we'll do our best to do so by email after the session is closed. I should also mention that the webinar will be recorded. I'd like to talk briefly about the issue and set the scene a little bit before we get properly started. Some of you will know that the journal was originally founded in 1931 by Professor Friedrich Schneider of the University of Cologne. He was the leading educational comparativist in Germany at the time and the first scholar in the country to hold a professorship in comparative education. And his aim in creating the journal was twofold. He wanted to create a systematic basis for the new discipline of comparative education and to support international cooperation in and through education. And he was very active in that respect throughout his career and not solely through IRE. He was removed from his post in 1935 by the Nazis, and after the war relaunched and renumbered the journal, disowning the issues published between 1935 and 1943. The journal ceased publication in 1951 due to financial constraints, but was relaunched in 1955 by the UNESCO Institute for Education, or UIE, what's now known as UIL, the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, with Friedrich Schneider joining the editorial board. The decision of UIE's first director, Walter Merck, then the chair of comparative education at the University of Hamburg, to revive the journal rather than start an entirely new one was, I think, a deliberate statement of the Institute's commitment to international understanding and cooperation and to the humanistic rights-based vision of education it shared with UNESCO and with the United Nations. Its first editorial in 1955 set out its mandate to provide a meeting place for men and women from every country whose thoughts and actions deserve the attention of educationalists throughout the world, to inform readers as to educational theory and practice in various countries, and to explore the extent to which such ideas have elements of validity that transcend national boundaries. IRE has published without interruption ever since. It's considered the world's longest running international journal of comparative education. And its mission remains, in essence, the same, to foster understanding and cooperation in and through education by publishing the best new scholarship from around the world with the aim of influencing the development of policy and practice in the field of lifelong learning through evidence-based research. And far from becoming less relevant over the decades, these themes seem to me just as important as ever. I don't want to say any more because I know that some of these themes will be unpicked further by our speakers. Instead, I'll hand over now to Stephen, who will introduce the panelists and moderate the next part of our webinar.
Thank you very much, Paul. So the issue comprises 14 articles, but today we have time to discuss just 4. Otherwise, our webinar would have had to have become a symposium. But I think we can say that the 4 articles we've selected today represent a good cross-section of the concepts, the policies, practices, instruments, and discussions that animated the field of comparative education for the last 7 decades. So we hope that this webinar, for everyone taking part and everyone listening in, will whet your appetite to explore all of the 14 articles in this special issue. As Paul mentioned, they're available in open access. All of the 4 articles presented today are available currently in open access, and the link will be provided in the chat for you. And eventually, once the issue is fully compiled, all 14 articles will be available for a period of a minimum of 6 weeks in open access, with some of them permanently in open access. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenters. That is Maren Elfert and Gabriele Rabkin, and they are discussing an article on the humanistic approach to education, which was central to the work of UIE, then UIL, and of course reflected very much in the scholarship of IRE. Let me hand over to you. You'll need to unmute, Maren.
Here we go. Okay, yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the introduction. So the background of this paper that I co-authored with Gabriele Rabkin is that when we had put together the themes for this special issue, which was mainly done by Paul Stanistreet, I noticed that there was a topic missing, which was quite important for the history of the Institute and for the history of the journal. And that was the influence of Gottfried Hausmann, who, interestingly today, is actually not very well known anymore. And at the time, I met my friend and former collaborator, Gabriele Rabkin, who told me that she was writing something, that she was writing about the history of the projects that she had conducted with Gottfried Hausmann, also for the Institute. And then we decided to co-author this paper. So Gottfried Hausmann was the first professor of comparative education at the University of Hamburg, and he was a close friend of the Institute. He was an advisor of the Institute. He was also an editor of the IRE. And there is the building of the UNESCO Institute in Hamburg. In that building is a room, the Hausmann room, which hosts the visiting fellows and interns. And Hausmann was also instrumental in discovering Paulo Freire for Germany. Freire came to Hamburg twice, in 1972 and in 1992, and both times Hausmann was instrumental in making that happen. So Hausmann this is from our article, A Reform Pedagogue in the Hermeneutic and Humanistic Tradition, and very much embodied the philosophy of a pedagogy based on questions rather than answers, which is also very much the philosophy of lifelong learning as it was conceptualized in UNESCO. So the paper has 4 sections. The first section outlines the humanistic foundations of the UNESCO Institute for Education, and some early educational thinkers in the humanistic tradition who have played a role in the foundation of the Institute and published in the journal. And then in the second section, we outline some of UIE's policy-related research in the field of lifelong learning and literacy during the first 4 decades of its existence. And then in the third section, we come to this particular line of work that Gabriele will talk about, which was very much influenced by Gottfried Hausmann. And then in the fourth section, we reflect on contemporary discourses that are presented in a humanistic guise, such as social and emotional learning, but often in a truncated and market-oriented form. So just very briefly, here I'm just trying to, yeah, exactly. So there were several strands of educationists that were involved in the Institute and published in the IRE in its early years. representing somewhat different humanistic traditions. So there was a very strong scientific humanism, which was represented by Maria Montessori, who was one of the members of the first governing board of the Institute. Then there was the popular education movement, represented by Johannes Novrup, who was the first chairperson of the Institute's governing board and who came from the Danish folk high school movement. And then there was the tradition of the Geisteswissenschaften, which is a very German phenomenon, like the attempt to scientifize the humanities, of which education became a part. And for example, Isaac Kandel, who was one of the early comparativists, who published in the IRE, could be associated with this. So these people, they all were different in background, expertise, and orientation, but they were representatives of what Jürgen Schriever referred to as the Welterziehungsbewegung, the world education movement, representing an idealistic and internationalist worldview. And just again, very briefly, after the publication in 1972 of UNESCO's report Learning to Be, also known as the 4 report, the UNESCO Institute for Education engaged in a research, a big research initiative on the conceptualization of the concept of lifelong learning. So this was all very much in this humanistic tradition. And the influence of Paulo Freire on the Institute is also notable. At the end of the 1960s, Gottfried Hausmann had been asked by the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation in Germany to produce an evaluation of Freire's pedagogy and literacy approach. And Hausmann asked his students to comment on his report. And this resulted in a vibrant series of meetings with lots of red wine and discussions about Paulo Freire, and resulted in this special issue, which had to be reprinted 7 times. And so literacy was also a very important field of work in the 1980s, which again was very much in this humanistic tradition, literacy as a continuum. And here you can see the 1992 visit of Paulo Freire to the University of Hamburg, where he discussed with Gottfried Hausmann and Bogdan Suchodolski. And here you can see these 2 old men being surrounded by admiring students. And this brings me to Gabriele Rabkin, who was, in fact, Gottfried Hausmann's doctoral student, and who has collaborated with him. And so now I turn over to Gabriele.
Yeah, thank you, Maren, and hello to all of you. In the last years of his life, my mentor Gottfried Hausmann initiated the literacy project Creativity, Culture and Basic Education, Unconventional Ways to Writing and Culture, a 5-year collaborative project between the UIE and the Hamburg school authorities. UIE's director Paul Berlanger then supported this idea. At that time, I was using art-based approaches in my work with children who struggled to learn to read and write. I began to offer stimuli to overcome children's resistance in writing. Hausmann related my approach to the genetische Ganzheits- and Gestaltpsychologie of the Leipzig school, who had a special focus on the development of emotional processes. On this theoretical basis, I developed didactic principles in order to use the creative impulses in teaching. Our approach was situated in the international literacy movement and aligned with a humanistic approach to lifelong education. Our concept of literacy was not limited to basic skills such as reading and writing, but emphasized the importance of emotions in the ability of children to develop certain skills. Next folio, please. Yes. Another offspring of the Hausmann initiative was a family literacy pilot project, which was again devised as a collaborative project with Maren Elfert and Stephen Roche, drawing on international learning projects around the world. The pilot project, which was given the name FLY by children, was launched in selected schools in Hamburg. Schools opened up for families and provided them opportunities to engage with their children, with their children's teachers, and participate in education activities. In 2010, FLY received UNESCO's King Sejong Literacy Prize. This was the first time ever a UNESCO prize was awarded to Germany, and the prestige of the international award helped to expand the project to a larger number of schools in Hamburg and secure its sustainability until today. Next folio, please. Thank you. The production of creative learning materials formed an important part of the project, as these materials were created with the involvement of learners. They had a personal and emotional connection to stimulate reading and writing. An example of learning materials were 17 multilingual mini-books, short stories and commentaries written by family members for their preschool children provided biographically significant context for the children and parents. Creative and arts-based education has been influential also in other areas such as peace building. During the last years, I had the chance to work in this field at the University of Hamburg in an interdisciplinary peace initiative. As I wrote in a former IIE article, if one assumes that peace begins where people have learned to perceive each other and find a way to live with mutual tolerance, then it can also be understood as a contribution to peace education. Thank you so much.
Okay, just to wrap up. So in the last, thank you, Gabriela. In the last section of the paper, we write about the remnants of humanistic thinking in education. And we also look at some of what UNESCO did afterwards in terms of this humanistic approach. And then we discuss in particular the concepts of mindfulness and social and emotional learning that appear in this OECD report on the future of education and skills as one of the future constructs in education that the OECD wants to work with. So we write that these remnants of humanistic principles still exist, but that they are overshadowed by instrumentalist approaches, and that are all too often reduced to marketable concepts. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Maren and Gabriela. That's very, very interesting. I just should remind everybody participating that there will be some space at the end of the 4 presentations for presenters to answer any questions you may have. And we've given the restriction of time, we decided the most efficient way to do it is for you to write your questions into the chat. And then we will collect those and answer as many of them as possible at the end. So please fire away as you're listening, because it can be hard sometimes to remember later. You can just write them straight into the chat. Okay, so there's a nice segue between the presentation you just heard and the one to come. Maren and Gabriela talking about the humanistic tradition that was initially really deeply rooted within the field of comparative education. And I think it's worth noting that the CIES will celebrate its 70th anniversary next year. So IRE is very much kind of in tandem. It grew alongside the field. And our next presenter, Michelle Schweisfurt, will look at that kind of tandem growth. So she'll look at the debates that defined the field of comparative education as it emerged in the 1950s and 60s, and the role of IRE. I thought she uses a very nice dual metaphor as the both mirror and lamp to that process. So, Michelle, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much to Paul and Maren for the invitation to contribute to this special issue. It was really interesting reading through the archives of the IRE. I'm not going to pretend that I read every single article of the last 70 years, but I used some of the titles and especially abstracts to focus on something that I find quite interesting. I'm interested in what unites the field of comparative and international education, but also what divides it. And so I was looking at some of the parallel messages that were going on in the different changes over time within the IRE. So the title of my article is Comparative and International Educations, Histories, Ideologies, Contestations, and the International Review of Education. And it starts off with this, defining comparative and international education and circumscribing its practical and ideological agendas have been preoccupations in the field into the present day. I don't know if other fields of inquiry have these same constant efforts to define boundaries and to think about what it means to be in that field, but it's certainly true for comparative and international education. Divisions in the field run deep between methodological paradigms, disciplinary differences, and even fundamental understandings of purpose, to debates on how geopolitics and colonialities have shaped dominant narratives. The plural histories of our plural field do not necessarily add up to a clear trajectory. Arguably, they have greater resemblance to a series of parallel competing narratives. And in my experience of reading through the articles in the IRE, it as a journal reflects these contestations and potentially sheds light on them. Bob Cowan described the field as a field of comparative educations, in fact, plural. And we've highlighted, a number of us who comment on the field have highlighted the competing positions that coexist in contrasting epistemic communities that have different agendas, methodological preferences, and normative positions. And increasingly, we also see ideological fault lines, and particularly at the moment, there is a very hot debate about the way that the field has been entangled with the colonial project and different ways that that is understood. And as I said, the IRE has proven to be a salient example of these divisions, although within the journal, of course, they play out in particular ways. So one of the big debates that I found within the journal is the big question of what comparative and international education is for. And this has been a recurrent theme in the journal since the very first issue, when some of the so-called founding fathers of the field set out their stalls about what the field was for. For example, is it about identifying universal aims for education? Is it about finding equivalences and measurements for comparison? Is it about intercultural understanding in the more kind of humanistic tradition that Maren and Gabriella were just talking about? I also found a fair bit of evidence about methodology and disciplinary foundations and the so-called paradigm wars, questions about what constitutes rigor or sound evidence or theoretical value. And the disciplinary foundations have been set out variously as philosophical, historical, sociological, global. But over time, it was quite interesting that sociology seemed to become more prominent in the journal than some of the other disciplinary traditions. But I guess where things start to get really interesting is in the ways that context, coloniality, and power play out in the field, but also in the journal. And as in the field, in the journal, attention to context is a recurrent theme. and championing alternative and including Southern perspectives has been gaining prominence. And the discourses around this definitely take a more normative and culturalist turn at the turn of the 20th century, starting in the journal with an article by Leon Tickley in 1999, but also volume 45, which is dedicated entirely to Indigenous education. So we hear more and more a particular stance, a more ideologized stance about this issue of context and linking it to the questions of colonialism. So as Stephen said, I build a metaphor, not a unique one. It's not mine. It has been used elsewhere. But thinking about IRE as the mirror and the lamp of CIE. So in some ways, it's a mirror. It reflects wider developments in the field. It reflects the contestations, but it also illuminates them. So it sheds a particular light on them because of its own history. So, for example, in the early history of the journal that was discussed at the beginning of the webinar, we see these ideological ruptures at the beginning and end of the Nazi era, which are a cautionary tale of how CIE can be twisted to mirror and illuminate very different visions of education and evidence and internationalism. But over time in the journal, we see less reflection on CIE as a field and more about its application to particular global challenges, such as the development of democracy or the issue of language in education. And of course, the shift in 2012 to a focus in lifelong learning also gives the IRE a particular flavor. And of course, over time, increasingly reflecting the agendas and priorities of UNESCO, including UNESCO's own contradictions. And Maren has written quite eloquently about this, the different ways that UNESCO situates itself. It is fundamentally humanistic in its orientation, but there are such strong agendas globally, for example, around the SDGs, that it is sometimes brought into those and seems to be having its own parallel discourses going on within the organization, which are then reflected within IRE. So from human rights and interculturality to issues like measurement. So kind of summing up, fault lines, yes, within the journal as within the field. But it seemed to me as I was reading through the articles that these fault lines within IRE are playing out in a particularly diplomatic way. There's not an awful lot of confrontation going on in the journal. You know, the debates about the purpose of CIE and the ones about coloniality are actually very, very bitter in our field at the moment. And IRE's conciliatory discourses, question mark, are these a reflection of UNESCO's neutrality, or is something else going on? Or is this just not where some of the more strident commentators choose to publish their work? I also noticed that the World Council for Comparative Education Societies had quite a strong presence in the journal in the past. And at one time, you know, WCCS itself was quite a conciliatory sort of organization that was trying to bring together very many different traditions in CIE. I wouldn't say that tradition has been sustained, but I think that too feels to me to be part of what's going on. I don't have strong evidence on this. It's purely anecdotal and what I have read, but it does seem to me that some of the more strident and ideologized discourses that we see in various comparative educations and in some of the other journals are somewhat less visible in IRE, although, as I've said, we still do see these things happening in parallel. So, and there are some references, including some of the articles that I've referred to from the journal, but other articles as well.
Thank you very much, Michelle. That was very, very interesting. So again, just to take note, I saw one person put up their hand. I took note of who it was, but the best thing you can do if you have a question you want to ask is to write it into the chat, and then we'll be able to answer all of those at the end. Okay. So there is also between the article or the presentation you just heard and the one to come, there is a certain crossover as well thematically, in that our next presenters, Kelly Harris and Shamistha Bharat, will take up the issue of coloniality. So Michelle talked about the difficulty the comparative education community has had in a way shedding coloniality and the rupture that has created the entire discussion around that. And in our next presentation, the authors will talk about their article, which focuses on I suppose, the persistence of coloniality in education for development, particularly in relation to Africa. So I don't know if Kelly, would you like to speak first, or Shamistha, which of you would like to go first? Okay, so I'll hand over to Kelly Harris. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, I think I need to stop sharing in order for me to share my slides. Okay.
So you need Michelle to stop sharing. Perfect.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for hosting this webinar and for the opportunity to contribute to this special issue. And as Stephen said, I'm joined today by Shamistha Bharat, and we'll be sharing our article, Modernist Education and the Myth of Development in Africa, which we co-wrote with Jose Cosa, a Mozambican scholar and associate professor of lifelong learning and adult education, and also comparative and international education at Penn State University, where Shamistha and I are both doctoral students. So this was truly a collective effort, and this paper emerged from lots of shared conversations and collaborative writing, and our voices have all shaped this work. And unfortunately, Jose could not join us today, so Shamistha and I are presenting this to you today. So we wanted to engage the IRE to ask this question about the relationship between education and development. And we went into this kind of with a few key questions. So first, what do education and development mean in the context of Africa? And second, how do we understand what modern means, and whose vision of a modern Africa is upheld and supported through education? And finally, how is colonialism manifest in the concept of a modern education and perpetuated through it? And philosophically, we draw on Ubuntu as a guiding framework for education in the African context, and Jose's interpretation of Ubuntu and the theory of Cosmo Ubuntu to point us to a system of education and development in Africa that's rooted in ancestral wisdom and that allows for a modern Africa that isn't bound by Western notions of modernity.
Thank you, Kelly. So we set about answering our questions by searching for articles with the keywords education and development in the journal's 70-year history. This allowed us to trace how authors connected education and development across pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial periods, and see how definitions of education and development shifted over time. Scholars in the IRE have explored this relationship and have long questioned the dominance of Western educational models in Africa. Our article helps continue this discussion and shows how debates related to education and development persist and evolve. Through our work, we wanted to challenge the dominant assumptions about lifelong learning and formal education, and even what counts as modern. So on the one hand, we see that global lifelong learning models often assume that learning happens primarily through formal institutions. On the other hand, African traditions demonstrate that lifelong learning is community-based, relational, and woven into social life. And this is often categorized as informal or non-formal simply because this form of education doesn't resemble European school structures. This idea reflects a hierarchy where African knowledge and language are seen as lacking in sophistication. And yet we see that they offer valuable insights for present-day lifelong learning discourses and sustainable development efforts. So our work contributes to the special issue by identifying long-term patterns in how education is tied to broader debates about modernity, development, and dependency, and offers an alternative framework based on the African philosophy of Ubuntu. Thank you, Kelly. So what did we learn? So as per our analysis, we found that the authors writing about African education point out that colonial education marked a rupture from African knowledge systems, as the purpose of education shifted from communal well-being and sustainability to producing labor for colonial economies. The articles also show that colonial policies promoted education as part of a civilizing mission, emphasizing urbanization and European cultural values. During the colonial and post-colonial periods, we also notice an enduring tension between nation-building needs and valuing African knowledge. This becomes more pronounced in post-colonial educational agendas that exhibit this tension between the desire for the Western schooling to participate in global economies and the need to affirm African identity and reinstate African epistemologies. So the articles reveal that modern in Africa has been deeply contested. In the colonial period, modern meant becoming more European. Western etiquettes, norms, Western schooling, urbanization, these were the key criteria to be modern. In post-colonial period, modern became tied to industrialization, nation building, and global competitiveness. Hence, we see that modern education founded upon human capital theory has created ongoing economic and cultural dependency for the African nations. Western donors, development agencies, and global institutions continue to influence what is seen as modern or progressive. Education systems still feel the pressure to align with global or often Western economic models, reinforcing reliance on external definitions of modernity rather than the African-led ones. Indeed, we see that the idea of development itself is defined in terms of Western linear progress, creating a myth that African nations must catch up by adopting the imported systems. This shows how modernist and Western frames shape educational development in Africa and limits the scope for Africa-centered approaches. Thank you, Kelly.
So one of the main themes that we saw in looking at the articles over time was this question and this role of language in education, which was strongly present in the journal from the beginning. Language practices serve as a lens through which we can examine coloniality and African education, because language is critical to lifelong learning as knowledge is transmitted through language. So the formal education in colonial languages largely replaced education in mother tongue, and in doing so, effectively disconnected Africans from their ancestors, from knowledge systems, and from communities. And since communication and learning in African languages is needed to theorize outside of Eurocentric notions of modernity, the role of European languages in education remains a major way in which colonialism and cultural imperialism endures. And therefore, language reclamation remains critical in ongoing efforts to decolonize education in Africa. And just to be clear, this isn't about replacing languages or erasing a colonial imprint, but rather finding language practices and using language practices that reorient education toward African value systems. And so in what we were trying to do by proposing alternative frameworks is looking at theories rooted in African cosmology like Cosmo Ubuntu, which can provide alternative frameworks for education. So Cosmo Ubuntu can allow for a reorientation and a recontextualization that honors ancestral wisdom, relational personhood, and the continuity of knowledge. And Cosmo Ubuntu involves a perception of the human that lacks the idea of an individual self, of classification, and of hierarchies. And there's also a nonlinear notion of time. Contemporary perspectives on decolonization call for a separation of Western epistemology from ideas about modernity. And so efforts to decolonize African education must also involve discussions of the ontological and epistemological foundations of ideas like education and development. And so here on the slide, there's a picture of Sankofa, which is a mythical bird in African cosmology that is facing forward while looking back. And so here we see the past, present, and future as interconnected and juxtaposed. And so when we center African cosmology and, for example, use Sankofa, the principle of Sankofa, we see that African education needs to be firmly rooted in ancestral wisdom in order to remain faithful to an African reality that isn't bound by Western notions of what is modern. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. The bell just went and you hit it exactly. Very well done. Thank you. Okay, moving on. I'm sorry, I think I may have, and Jan sent me a message, I think very politely pointing out my error. I had said to put your questions into the chat. I should have been more specific. Put your questions into the Q&A box, which is next to the chat at the bottom of your screen. So now that brings us to our final of the four presentations for our webinar today. It was important to us, to Paul and Maren and myself, when we started out conceiving of this special issue, that it would not be just a celebration of IRE, that we would also take a critical look at both the journal itself and its body of work, and the field of comparative education as reflected in it. And I think the next article is a good reflection of that more critical view by Elaine Unterhalter, and she looks at the way that issues of gender and sex and sexuality have featured, or in many cases not featured, in IRE, and to the extent to which that also reflects a certain silencing or neglect and contestation within the field more generally. So, Elaine, if you're ready to jump in, I would ask you to unmute and give us your presentation.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and joining others in thanking the editors for the opportunity to contribute to the specialism and to read through this really interesting history of 70 years of work. My article subtitle is about cumulative, collective, or conservative, and it's looking at scholarship, both the scholarship written by women or by women and contributing to scholarly themes, and work that looked at gender, sexuality, sex, and intersectionality over 7 decades, and looking at the ways in which this linked with education. I took this idea of a cumulative and collective scholarship from an article that Nelly Stromquist had written in 2014, where she was commenting on the work of Paulo Freire and seeing, and I think that's resonating with Maren and Gabriella's presentation of this presence of Paulo Freire as a very important, maybe ancestral spirit for the journal, but that scholarship in this field is cumulative and collective, but it's often being highly criticized for being conservative and not dealing enough with the kind of trenchant issues of inequality, injustice, and violence, which feminist activism and anti-colonial activists have raised. I also wanted in the article to think about what we can learn from the past, because the present contemporary moment is a very frightening one. It's a frightening one of widening inequalities, concentrations of wealth and power in relation both to education and all other spheres of politics and economics and cultural and social life, huge attacks on the powerless. And gender is often a key target of those attacks. And gender and one's way in which one talks about gender becomes a kind of shibboleth, a dividing point in which one is or isn't seen as acceptable. So just this chance to do this historical sweep was very grounding for me as trying to think, how had people lived through other periods of conflict? What had they written about? How had they engaged with it, or what have they said? If we can take the first slide is my manual counts of the articles in IRE over the 70 years. And I did it by decade, and I looked at the number of articles with female authors, the number of articles that addressed gender, sex, sexuality, and or intersectionality, and the number of articles by male authorial teams that dealt with those themes. And what you can see in column 3 is how few women were writing in the fields of comparative and international education, even though this is an area in which women had been working for more than 100 years as teachers, as researchers, as administrators, as curriculum developers. So but it's only from the 80s that women's presence starts to be noted in authorship. But by the present day, the field is more than 2/3, or nearly 2/3, constituted by women writers. We also see in column 4 that the period of the 50s and 60s and 70s, a period of considerable feminist mobilization and activism around women's rights and gender equality, was not a period in which much work was published in the journal on those themes. Those themes only start to emerge from the 80s, partly linked to the prominence of a number of significant gender scholars. And then from the 90s, these themes grow. What's interesting in the contemporary, the last decade, is that while the proportion of women authors has increased, those women authors are writing on a broader range of topics than gender, sex, sexuality, and intersectionality. We also see the small number of male authors who write on these questions, and that there tends to be because of their many of them are working on statistical studies of girls in or out of school, or gender and learning outcomes. What the article does as well, if we can lose the slide for now, is it also looks at the regional presence of different authors, and that some regions are many more articles focus on particularly Africa and particularly cross-national or global themes, and that certain themes are particularly present in relation to certain regions rather than others. If we take the second slide, this is based on my analysis of the articles that, the 131 articles over the 70 years that deal with these themes of gender, sex, sexuality, and intersectionality, and which decades they were published in. And the article partly relates this to histories of UNESCO's focus on gender and lifelong learning, which you can see is the area that most articles are focused on, but also on debates within the global field. And what I think this table might highlight for people who are very steeped in this literature is a number of key absences. There's no article published on gender-based violence or school-related gender-based violence. There's just about nothing on intersectionality, issues about race, gender and race, gender and disability, or ethnicity. So whether this is the conciliatory or mainstream terrain, or whether it is some of the issues Michelle was raising about where critical scholars might seek to publish, there are interesting presences and interesting absences. if we lose the slide, my last few points are about the nature of the scholarly community. I think what emerges to me is that it's not a single or homogenous group. It's very diverse, and the range of disciplinary perspectives, the range of engagements, theoretical, practical, or political, that are taken are quite diverse. But what we see is an intermingling of gender and education scholarship with other forms of ideas, and looking at the dialogue, the debate, the connectivity or relationality with those processes. We see the way that gender links to practice. That's a major theme of how raising the question of gender with intersectionality pushes, develops, enlarges reflections on practice. And then there's a substantive amount of work that is highly reflexive. It uses the issue of stance, the particular political, cultural, disciplinary stance of the author. Positionality is a term that's only used much later, but to really develop some methodological and relational ideas about gender and education. And I think that it's this where the history and this continuous engagement, the presence of the journal is so important, because I think it presents us with many cases of potentials where alliances need to be built, and how we can sustain and support those at this contemporary moment, which is a moment of great anxiety, vulnerability, and threat, but also a moment when we need to listen to each other and draw the experiences we share and want to take forward. So thanks, Stephen. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Elaine, and thank you, Elaine, and thank you all for such impeccable timekeeping. I didn't really have to remind anyone at all about your timing. So we have about 10 minutes left, which is perfect. I've been reading through the questions in the Q&A. Some very interesting questions have been asked. So I think what I will do is, some of them have been answered already by some of the panelists. But I think we can open up a few of the questions and see if we have any takers. Now, John Halford asked about the Cold War, which of course is, when we're talking about the period from the mid-1950s, a good 35 years of the early years of the field of comparative education and IRE, of course, occurred within the context of the Cold War. And he asked about to what extent the ideological battles around comparative education and IRE could be seen as part of a wider Cold War ideological struggle, and how has the end of the Cold War, and he points this question particularly to Maren and Gabriele, how has that affected the humanistic discourse within comparative education? Would either of you perhaps like to take that up and offer a quick answer?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. It's a great question, John. The Cold War, the end of the Cold War, I think, was actually a bit of a problem for UNESCO because it gave legitimacy to UNESCO's role, right? Because especially the Institute was one of the places where people could meet. There were usually scholars, researchers invited from countries behind the Iron Curtain. And then this role, was then lost for UNESCO. I think I was in a seminar recently at Humboldt University, and there was a scholar from Prague who was working on humanistic education as well from the socialist side, and he said that there were actually lots of commonalities between because there was also the concept of humanism was also very important, behind the Iron Curtain, right? Because it was a secular way to talk about. It was a secular humanist approach to education, which there were actually lots of commonalities there. So I mean, how did it change after the Cold War ended? I think it's a problem that we don't have any alternative in general, not only for education, that we don't have any alternative system anymore. I personally think that's a problem because now we have we are stuck in this human capital, still very capitalistic, economistic approach to education. But it's a complex question. Like in a few minutes, I feel a little bit, overwhelmed by it. But it's a great question. Maybe you could share your thoughts sometime about this as well, or in the chat.
Thank you, Maren. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot exactly.
No, it's great. It's a great question. I'm glad to do it. Yeah.
I mean, what's coming clear to me is that this discussion has great potential to be opened out into other fora. So we'll do the best we can with the limitations we have right now.
I think Elaine had her hand up.
Okay, Elaine, do you want to come in there?
Just on the question, I was very struck, and Maren has explained it now because it was so striking in the 50s and the 60s. The articles that they were very uncritical, the articles coming from the Soviet Union and from Eastern Europe in relation to gender, but it was very striking to see them there. And Maren's now explained probably some of the background to those articles. But what's also interesting is that after the end of the Cold War, that presence of that stream of literature really tapers off. So that this is in relation to the articles on gender, so that the axis of work in relation to gender becomes Western and Southern, if you are looking from Europe, and that engagement with Eastern Europe and the countries that had been in the historic Soviet bloc, there's a silence about them. So it's a very, very interesting question about how different forms of geopolitics shape different knowledge ecologies.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. Now, there have been several questions around the issue of decolonization of education and coloniality in education. One that I find particularly interesting is by Reem Ben Giaber. I'm sorry if I'm mangling their name. And it goes, in the attempt to decolonize comparative education, have scholars proposed that CIE reshapes itself and restricts itself to being an analytical discipline and not so much a programmatic or developmental one? Would anyone like to venture also a very big question, but maybe the beginnings of an answer to that question? I would maybe poke either Michelle or Kelly or Shamista for an answer on that, if you would hazard one.
It is an enormous question, Stephen, but thank you for asking it, Reem. I come back to this comparative educations. I think there are scholars who have stuck to a more analytical, disciplinary view of CIE. others very much in the direction of the programmatic developmental one, others who have seen this decolonization agenda as something that should be turning CIE upside down completely, you know. So I think that there is not a unified direction that CIE scholars are moving in, but certainly we see both of those and other directions going on as well. Some of them more or less ignoring the decolonial perspective, some engaging with it to the exclusion of almost everything else, and others taking it on board, but not necessarily seeing profound change as part of the way forward.
Thank you, Michelle. I have a quick question for Paul. How free are we to run over time a little, because we've just hit our end time? Will we give ourselves another 10 minutes?
Yeah, I think it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. In that case, there's a question has just come in which I think might be of interest to Elaine. I was curious if there has been fear or concern. Hang on, it's after jumping down now. Oh, was it answered? Sorry, just one moment.
I think you've seen my answer.
You just answered it. In that case,
yeah.
I'll jump ahead. I think, in fact, there's a question here that can probably best be answered by Paul, and that is from Aaron Benevot, and he's asking about the extent to which the views and positions of the director of UIL and indeed the editor of IRE influences the direction of the journal, for example, in the choice of special issues.
Yeah,
I can't actually find the question, but I'm remembering it more or less. Paraphrasing.
I think over the decades it's fluctuated, and I think the role of the director with regard to the journal has changed also. So I think there are points where you can see, and it's as Aaron says, it's reflected in the choice of special issues, where there's a stronger interest from within UIE or UIL in directing the content of the journal to serve the kind of wider purposes of the institute. As I say, I think that's a trend that's been going the other way in recent years, that there's less and less influence on the editorial outlook of the journal. It's certainly been true in the time that I've been here. There's been more focus on the editorial independence of the journal and less on steering it. So of course we try to reflect the values of UNESCO and the areas of focus of the institute, but we're not kind of directed by them in that way. So I think it has changed. I think for a long time it was effectively edited within the institute by the director's office. But I think that's changed now, and there's now more of a kind of a separation between the executive of the institute and the executive editor's role. I would say it's just the beginnings of an attack.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I think we probably would need to wrap it up now. There are several other questions. Some have already been answered. I think we can hand back over to Paul if you would like to just make a few concluding comments, and we'll wrap it up.
Yep. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you to all of our panelists who I think gave a very rich, very interesting, multi-layered insight into how some of the core themes of IRE over the decades have evolved, and also what important themes have been comparatively neglected, which of course is just as interesting and worth talking about. And I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of the questions within our time, but we'll try to follow up by email afterwards. I hope that you'll be inspired to delve a bit deeper into the articles of our contributors, as well as the other articles in the issue. All the articles will be available open access, as Stephen said, until the end of the year, and in most cases thereafter. So please do check them out. I think they offer a really fascinating insight into the life of a journal and its times. On a more personal note, I'd just like to say I'm very proud of this issue, and it's been a wonderful collaboration with brilliant authors and two equally brilliant co-editors. So I'd like to thank Maren and Stephen for their collaboration throughout the process. I'd also like to thank Maya Kieselbach for overseeing the speedy editing of the articles under significant pressure, and Rosalind Herner for organizing the webinar and for doing lots of other preparation around the anniversary, both important contributors who don't always get the acknowledgement that they deserve. So thank you again for taking part. I very much hope that you enjoyed the session, and goodbye.